Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Quebec election forecast. This is not a normal one, though. This is more of a hypothetical question. So with that, I want to just do all my regular YouTube things. Thanks for being a channel member. I appreciate the support you guys give me, and by all means, if you want to support the work I do here, go in the link in the description below and press that join button. But otherwise, do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment below, and make sure to hit me up with some Q&A questions for the end of the month Q&A. But with that, let us begin. So this model here is my version 1 of the by-election forecast model. So there could be amendments made to this because this is new. I've never done this before in a proper sense. Now, the idea behind this is by-elections are essentially a very big poll and a very accurate poll for the most part because people actually voted. So in principle, they should be at least somewhat indicative of voting behavior. Now, this is not going to be always true, and you can't generalize too far because, say, the trend in Arthabaska could be very different to the trend over here in Duplessis, or it could be very different to the trend in Terrebonne versus the trend in Laval. Those could be different trends. However, and there's other consideration too, is leaders of parties can change and platforms can pivot or big events can happen, which make some by-elections not considerable. In this particular case, I'm not actually considering the St. Henri St. Anne by-election because Quebec Solidaire got a new leader and the Liberals got a new leader. So I think that wildly changes the implications of that by-election because I really think that by-election is more of a referendum on Dominic Anglade being bad and people liking Dubois. But Dubois is gone now and Pablo Rodriguez is not Dominic Anglade. But that said, we do kind of have this forecast here. Now, there is some... You should take this with salt. This is not a proper forecast. This is not a robust prediction. This is just an outside hypothetical. And the reason why I'm making this, and the reason why this looks so dramatic for the Parti Quebecois, is they're doing substantially better in the by-elections than they're doing in the polls. So we bring up this. So this is the raw polling data. We can see in the last 3 polls, Palace, Leger, Main Street, 3 good firms, all within a week of each other. They have approximately the exact same outcome with a little bit of noise on the Liberals. Now, this is nothing like what we're seeing in the by-elections. These numbers here for the Liberals imply much better results for Arthabaska than actually happened. In fact, we would expect, if Main Street is correct with 29%, that the Liberals should be, vaguely speaking, a meaningful second place in Arthabaska. Arthabaska is also historically not actually a bad riding for the Liberals. They were second place by only 15 points behind the CAQ in 2018. They held it in 2014. So that isn't even a bad riding for the Liberals, but they get absolutely blown out of the water, and they only do marginally better than 2022. We can see this down here, actually. They only do marginally better to 9%. A 5.5 swing does not imply 29 points province-wide. Now, it could be the case that maybe the Liberals are doing amazing in Montreal, amazing in Laval, maybe even good in the suburbs of Montreal, but terrible everywhere else. That could be the case. Or it could be the case that, as I said before, there's this honeymoon effect because Pablo's new, and these numbers are not entirely accurate. But even if we assume these numbers are not entirely accurate, and we go back to, say, March, because we can't really use... I guess we could go back to May. This is after Dubois has resigned. It's only one poll. It's 33 to 21. But even 21 is actually better than the implied swing. Okay, sure, this is 5.6. When we go to Terrebonne, the Liberals lost ground in Terrebonne. We go to Jean Talon. I don't know why I pronounce that one with so much more of an accent, but I do. The Liberals lost a lot of ground in Jean Talon. I mean, even in Saint Henri, Saint Anne, which I'm not considering in this regard, but the Liberals lost a good amount of ground here. So their by-election performances really are not indicative of a party that's actually gained substantial. This 21 would be a 51% increase. And again, maybe there is some subtleties. Maybe they're getting a lot in Montreal, or maybe they're losing a lot in heavy francophone areas. Hard to say. We would need more data. But it's very unlikely, in my mind, that these poll numbers for the Parti Quebecois, these 31s, are even remotely accurate. Like, none of these are commensurate with what we're actually seeing. Even back, for the most part, in Saint Henri, Saint Anne, like, this is +3. This is their worst by-election performance. But this is a time when the Quebec Solidaire still has a good leader. They have a good chance of winning this election. There's a lot of crossover between the bases of the Quebec Solidaire and Parti Quebecois. And this was really before Plamondon hit his stride. So even this is kind of dubious. It kind of implies that the PQ probably should be doing better. But then if we go to Jean Talon, 25 points. Terrebonne, 34 points. Arthabaska, 36 points. In Arthabaska, Terrebonne, and Jean Talon are in 3 different regions across Quebec. One's in the national capital, one is in Montreal suburbs, and then one is in rural Quebec. So these are 3 completely different ridings in 3 completely different areas, in 3 completely different parts of Quebec with very different electorates. And every single one of them, the Parti Quebecois is doing even better than the polls suggest they should be doing. Oops. I'll just bring up something here. I don't have this up because I was not prepared. So if we go here, we'll look at just this data momentarily. I don't really have anything most important to show you. I just wanted to show this here. So this is the numbers we're kind of looking across the board for the Parti Quebecois. Like 16, 15, 11, 13 in these regions. So if we look at, say, the rest du Quebec, and then we compare that to this number here, Arthabaska, where they're up 36 points. Now, notably, they're slightly underperform in this region. So if we look here, they got 16% in the rest of Quebec, and they got 10% in Arthabaska. So naively, we should actually expect them to be somewhere around 50% in the rest of Quebec based on this performance. Now, is that entirely accurate? Is that entirely something we can extrapolate? I'm not entirely sure. I have done it for the sake of this post because I thought it'd be kind of funny and, in some sense, a little clickbaity. But there is valid reasons, I think, to do this. The by-elections imply such a big swing. And the polls, while we have a good number, are not implying anything close to what we're seeing in the by-elections. And especially in the case because Pablo's brand new, we really don't have a lot of polls with him as leader. We only have polls him immediately after his taking over the leadership point. And at this stage, August 18th, when this video is coming out, his honeymoon should be over by now, but we hadn't had any more polls. So we don't really know if that was a temporary boost. But even in the polls we do have, these numbers are really not commensurate with what we're seeing. Because again, we go back to this. We scroll over. We're seeing in the rest of Quebec, the PQ are like 34. So they're up about 18 points. If the PQ are up 18 points in the rest of Quebec, I know I'm really beating a dead horse here, and they're doing 36 points here in Arthabaska, something wild is occurring. This, either Alex Boissonet is just an amazing candidate, or people just despise Duham which doesn't really seem to be the case because Doom actually does pretty well here. 13,000 votes up from 11,000 is pretty respectable in a by-election. And this is 60% turnout. This is a really high turnout by-election. Terrebonne is reasonably high turnout at 37%. And even Jean Talon, that's actually 55% turnout. Sure, it's all down from the last Quebec election, but these are by-elections. You would expect turnout to be lower, but these are still really high turnout by-elections. Again, even St. Henri, St. Anne, 31% is not an unreasonably different low turnout. That's a decent turnout for a by-election. So this is kind of what seeds this, but this is not just only the question of these by-elections imply a bigger thing. I do think there is, because Plamondon and the Parti Quebecois are really suggesting a quite dramatic action. One of the main things he wants to do is a referendum. That is one of the main things on the table. I do strongly suspect this is creating a very big shy Tory effect for the Parti Quebecois in Quebec, especially because the polls are showing that the Parti Quebecois voter base based on polling data is actually resembling that of what you would expect normally a right-wing party to look at. So it's more heavily into the male, more heavily into... one second here, I just check numbers. Yeah, more heavily into the men, more heavily into older voters. Now, and it's actually now, they're still leading among young voters, but the weakest demographic Parti Quebecois is the youth. And as we've seen very recently, especially in the last Canadian federal election, generally speaking, if you skew into older, male, rural voters, and also in the case of Parti Quebecois, they're also skewing more into higher income voters too, those voters vote more. They have higher turnouts. So, the Parti Quebecois demographic... and when I want to rephrase this. The male voter turnout is not necessarily higher proportionally compared to females, but parties that are favored by men tend to overperform in polls, which suggests to me that male voters lie to pollsters more, or just don't answer the phone as well, so the samples are not as good. But either reason for that, the Parti Quebecois voter base is kind of skewed more into demographics that you would expect polling error to be higher in: rural voters, older voters, young male voters, richer voters, people who turn out higher, who may not answer the polls as much, or might lie to pollsters. So a lot of these voters are the ones you would actually expect to cause a bounce to the Parti Quebecois in the polls. So we would expect them to actually overperform polls to begin with based on their demographic profile. We also, in a sense, expect them to overperform the polls because they have been overperforming the polls. They overperformed the polls actually quite substantially in 2022. Quite massively, in fact. So we would expect them to overperform the polls. We expect them... They have had a history of overperforming the polls, and they're overperforming them right now in by-elections by miles. And I suspect if this is true, and if my modeling is even notionally correct here, even notionally valid, we could easily see a very comfortable, very large Parti Quebecois majority. And if that does happen, I strongly suspect the Parti Quebecois will do the referendum, and it probably will pass. If we're in a world where the Parti Quebecois is getting 45.8% of the vote, that really tells me that polling saying that actually sovereignty is not very popular is probably not very accurate. Because the polling saying the Parti Quebecois is not very accurate, is not very popular, was not very accurate. And I will also note here, too, I'm just trying to bring it up here on my other screen. Here we go. I have done my own polling on this question. You can find this on my Substack, where I also post other things, but namely we're talking about this. So this is my most recent poll. This was back in May. It was in May. I published this in June. And this question captured in this poll is, do you want your province to become independent? Yes, let's become independent. Undecided, no, let's separate of Canada. We're actually looking at 39% say affirmatively, yes, let's become independent in Quebec. Only 52% say strongly no. And there's a 9% undecided. So even with that in mind, even if we don't say every single person who votes PQ wants to leave, it's very easy to get to around 46% with just these numbers. And that's only assuming fence sitters and yes, let's leave people are voting Parti Quebecois. They could be easily winning some people who don't want to actually leave but just don't like anyone else and are hoping that the referendum either doesn't happen or fails. Those people exist. I've actually talked to voters like that. I'm not sure what percentage of the electorate they are, but I know for a fact that type of voter does exist. So I won't make this video too much longer than it needs to be, but the gist here is this is, I think, a very interesting election to watch because at least right now, with all available evidence I have, based on by-elections, based on the actual polling that's happened, based on some of my own polls I've done, I actually think the Parti Quebecois might very well wildly overperform polls. Now, it could very well be the case that they actually perform like 38, 39%, which is still a massive overperformance because perhaps, for example, they aren't actually eating the entirety of Quebec Solidaire's lunch in Montreal. Maybe they're doing not very well in Laval or something like that, right? These are things that are possible. Maybe the Parti Quebecois' gain in Montreal, as per the St. Henri St. Anne by-election, is actually accurate. In that case, yeah, they might be lower than this. But even if we consider that, they're still going to be much higher than the polls are currently suggesting. And I will also just put another caveat here for anyone in the audience who is a Quebec Solidaire supporter. This is a very basic version 1 model of this. Don't take this too strongly that they're going to get completely wiped out by the Parti Quebecois. That's just kind of how the math worked, and it's not the most robust model. I think if I had another 4 by-elections to look at, I'd be much more confident, especially if I had a by-election that is reasonably recent in in Montreal area itself. The fact that St. Henri St. Anne is 3 years old with 2 different leaders in charge of the parties that were the most competitive. So it's not the most applicable here, but if we had a more applicable one, we'd get a better idea of what it was. But with that all said, I'll bid you guys adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.